Hey everyone, it's Mrs. Cantrell, and we are ready for the next chapter in Goat in the Garden. If you remember the last time, Mandy and James got help getting Lydia a new fence, and it's all put up, and Houdini has not gotten out yet. We'll see if he manages to get out. So we're at chapter 7, and our only clue is this picture of a crate. I don't know what that means. Let's find out. Extra food and a fence. That's not bad going, Dr. Emily told Mandy, as well as saving Houdini's life, of course. Mandy felt herself blush. Her plan was to save High Cross was going good. It was going from good to great. It was a warm spring day at last, and they were relaxing on the sunny patio at the side of the house. The pink blossoms were just beginning to bud on the trees. How nice to just sit out in the sun, Dr. Emily said, curled like a cat in a cream canvas chair. Olivia and Lady Jane are about to kid, Mandy said, squinting up at the horizon. Lydia says it won't be long now before the goats are born. So when goats have babies, it's called that they're kidding. Okay, so when she says they're about to kid, that means they're about to give birth to the baby goats. Does that mean you won't be in for lunch? Her mom said, trying to hide a smile. What about Grandma and Grandpa? They're coming over later. Mandy stood and paced up and down the patio. They won't mind if I'm not here, will they? Just this once. She looked at her watch. James was due any minute. Oh dear, you're as bad as any father waiting for the birth of a first baby, her mother said. Can't you sit down? Sorry. Mandy sat. I'm sure everything's going to be fine. Lydia's used to doing this. She chewed nervously at the end of her thumb. Oh, come on, James, she said. Why don't you go on ahead and I'll tell him to follow, Dr. Emily suggested. But just do one thing for me, dear. What? Mandy was on her feet, quick as a flash, heading for her bike in the garage. Just stop at Lilac Cottage to explain. Your grandmother and grandfather will understand, I'm sure. Anything to do with Mandy and animals took first place. They knew. Mandy nodded and gave a sheepish grin. Okay, and tell James to hurry. She shot off on her bike up the lane, stopping briefly at her grandparents' house. Grandpa was busy in the backyard. He was mulching his prize leeks, getting ready for the fair. Mandy explained her errand at High Cross. Oh, he said, goats ready to kid, eh? Well then, he stood up and grinned broadly. What's this about goats? Grandma came bustling out of the house. Who's having a kid? Well then, what are you waiting for? Better get a move on. Mandy didn't need telling twice. Thanks, she yelled as James rode up on his bike. All the way up past Beacon House and Upper Welford Hall, she felt convinced that they would be too late. Olivia and Lady Jane would have had their kids during the night, and they would have missed it. Mandy had slowed down to a stroll by the time she crossed the yard at High Cross. James scooted up quickly from behind. We're too late, she said to him gloomily. I'm sure of it. Quick! Lydia shot out of the barn toward the house. She didn't stop to say hello. Help me get water on the boil. Then fetch some clean straw for the bedding. That's right. Just take the books out of it. Come on, get a move on. They all ran out of the kitchen together. Mandy climbed the ladder to the loft for fresh straw and scrambled down again with great armfuls. Shh, Lydia warned. Put the straw in the crate. Stand back. Give her plenty of room. They stood outside Olivia's pen, waiting anxiously. The goat turned and shifted sideways in her pen. She pawed at the stone beneath her straw as if trying to dig. All the time she pushed and barged around in her small space and ignored them. She's grinding her teeth, Lydia pointed out. That tells us she's nearly ready. What about the water? Mandy asked. They left 2 panfuls to heat on the fire. With luck, we won't need it, Lydia said. She looks to me as if she'll be able to manage. It was too much for James. I'll go check on the water anyway. He gulped and shot out of the barn. By now, Lydia stood straining, and sure enough, two little hooves appeared, with the tip of a dark nose easy to recognize. Lydia nodded. She went and stood by Olivia's head, encouraging her, whispering, "Good girl, Olivia, good girl." The goat pushed on. As the kid eased itself out, Lydia moved around smoothly to take its weight and lower it gently onto the straw. Then she stepped back to allow Olivia to lick the kid clean with her gentle tongue. Mandy stood by, enthralled. You know what enthralled means? Enthralled means she was just totally amazed by it, and she was just watching for all she was worth. Quietly, Lydia came forward to help clean the kid. She rubbed softly with a towel, paying compliments to the new mother. "A fine kid. Well done. A little nanny for you, Olivia." From her pocket, she took a tiny brown bottle, placed a corner of the towel against it, and poured out a drop or two of strong smelling liquid. She dabbed the end of the kid's cord with it. "Iodine," she explained. "Now it's time to put her in the crate. Lift her gently." So when it says she dabbed the kid's cord, we all have a belly button, and when we're born, we have a longer umbilical cord that the doctor cuts for us, and then he puts medicine to help it dry up sometimes. And so that's what Lydia was doing to help dry up the kid or baby goat's umbilical cord. Eventually, it'll just drop off. It just dries up kind of like a weed and drops off. Mandy lifted the gangling, kicking creature and put it bleating into the safety of the crate while Lydia went to work, quickly milking an exhausted Olivia. "Then you can rest," she told her. "Don't worry, we'll take care of your little daughter." And she explained to Mandy that what she was taking from Olivia was colostrum, which they would feed to the kid from a bottle. It's full of antibodies to protect the little ones from illness. Then the milk comes. Mandy nodded. She was learning so much with the birth of this kid. "You missed it," she told James, who had sidled gingerly back into the barn. "Ah, but we'll need you both this time," Lydia said, opening the door to Lady Jane's pen. Her smile had changed to a frown. Lady Jane was smaller than Olivia, and this was her first both. "She's carrying more than one kid," Lydia explained, "and I'm afraid she's struggling." James swallowed hard and pushed his glasses further onto his nose. "Okay?" Mandy asked. He nodded. "What do I have to do?" "Get the water quickly," Lydia ordered. She'd taken off her jacket and slung it over the door. "And bring the disinfectant standing on the windowsill." They ran, fear shooting through them. Something might go badly wrong unless they hurried. They raced back, balancing the pans of hot water carefully covered with lids. Lydia put it and some disinfectant into a metal bowl, dipped a cloth into it, and talked calmly to Lady Jane, whose head was down. She was making a dreadful grinding noise with her teeth. "There, there," Lydia soothed. "It'll soon be over." She washed the goat's hindquarters, then she scrubbed her own hands and arms. "You stand by the head," she told James. "Keep talking. Tell her it'll be all right." She nodded to Mandy. "I'll need you back here. Be ready to take this first kid and clean it up while I deal with the second." Then she soaped one hand thoroughly. "See? No head showing." She pointed to the two tiny hooves. Then she took hold of them and pushed hard so that the kid disappeared completely back into the womb. "Just a bit of rearranging," she said, very matter of fact. She felt her way. "I have to bring the head forward." And she went on turning the invisible kid into the correct position. "Good girl," James stammered. His voice sounded wobbly. Lydia stood back at last and waited for the hooves to reappear. This time the little point of the nose came with them. They sighed. Now everything went as before. Lydia eased the kid out into the world, handed him to Mandy, and let her clean him off. The twin came soon after, easy as anything. So there were three perfect kids, fluffy and black, with white speckles and stripes to tell from one another. The two mother goats were comfortably bedded down, and James recovered enough to come and coo over the babies in the box. Lydia named each one in turn. "Catherine," she said. and Anne. They were wives of Henry VIII, I think. She considered the male for a while. Well, why not Henry? She decided. They went out beaming into the early afternoon sunshine. We'll let the mothers feed them for a few days, after they've had a good rest, that is. Lydia was rolling down her sleeves and buttoning up her jacket in spite of the sun. Then we'll bottle feed and establish Lydia and Lady Jane in the milking routine. She was smiling with satisfaction at a job well done. Mandy poured the soapy water from the bowl into a drain outside the kitchen door. She took a deep breath of fresh air. Lydia gave her a tiny, friendly pat on the shoulder. "How do you like being a midwife?" she asked. "I love it," Mandy said, elated. She felt it was the most important thing she'd ever done in her life. James nodded, but he didn't quite put it into words. "Well done," Lydia told him. The day was made perfect when Mandy's parents turned up at the gate in their car. "We'll go away if you like," Dr. Emily called cheerfully. "We don't want to be in the way." "We couldn't keep away," Dr. Adams said sheepishly. "We want to take a look at the kids, if you don't mind, Miss Fawcett." Lydia hesitated for a half second, then treated him to one of her gracious, old-fashioned bows. She held one arm toward the barn and said, "This way, please." "Follow me." Mandy grinned at her mom and dad. They all went in together. Dr. Emily and Lydia bent close together over the crate, examining the newly born kids. "They're beautiful," Dr. Emily breathed. "You did so well." Mandy had already told her about the difficult birth. "Thank you," Lydia said shyly, accepting the praise. They all had tea at Highcross, and there were lively voices in the lonely rooms, bright chatter and satisfied smiles. "And how about the proud father?" Dr. Adam asked on the way out. So they went to visit Houdini in the top meadow, complete with fence, where celandines and watercress had come out on the banks of the stream to provide him with choice nibbles. I know that watercress is a kind of plant. I'm going to assume that a celandine is also a kind of plant that he would like to eat. He and Monty grazed peacefully together as the group approached. Houdini spotted them and graciously came over to say hello. Dr. Adam leaned his weight against the fence post to test it. "Pretty good," he said admiringly. They just started to discuss the pros and cons of removing the horns from young kids when up the path strode Sam Western with his two dogs. Houdini saw him first. Down went the head, and he charged right at the fence with an almighty crash. Mr. Western stopped in his tracks despite the strong high fence. He called his dogs to heel. "You there!" he shouted bossily. Lydia stiffened. She recognized him instantly, though he'd never paid her the honor of a visit before. "Calm down, Houdini." She talked gently to the goat until he agreed to trot off down the meadow. "Now what does he want?" she muttered, straightening her jacket. It was as if a dark cloud had come from nowhere over a perfect sky. "Need any help?" Dr. Adam asked. Mandy could only glower from a distance. That means she was kind of glaring at him, giving him a mad look. How dare Sam Western come up here after what he tried to do to Houdini? "No, thank you," Lydia said firmly. She went to open the gate, perfectly civil, and let Sam Western set foot on her land. "I'd set Houdini on him," Mandy muttered. "And he'd have the police on you," her mother pointed out. Their little group stood by and watched to see how Lydia would deal with Sam Western. The audience didn't put him off. "I've come to give you fair warning," he said in his loud, confident voice. He eyed the new fence and her group of friends with some surprise. "Have you now?" Lydia was still very calm. She only came up as far as Sam Western's shoulder, but she didn't give a scrap of fear in her body. "Yes, I know my rights in this matter, and I won't have your animals trampling all over my property." "No," Lydia agreed. "That's most unfortunate." Sam Western felt the glares from Mandy and the others, but this only seemed to make his temper worse. There are valuable plants in my garden, show plants, roses that are almost ready for the spring fair. Now I insist that you don't let your goats anywhere near my place in the future." Lydia nodded steadily. "I'll do my best." She eyed him squarely. She just looked him straight in the eye. But Sam Western stormed on. "I'm telling you, if it happens again, I won't answer for the consequences." "Then I'll do my best," Lydia promised. Sam Western glared at Houdini with concentrated hatred. His dogs lay growling at his feet. "That fence may look secure enough now," he said scornfully, "but I bet my life that goat will have it down within the week." Mandy couldn't take it any more. She flew down the road to join Lydia. "Ernie Bell built this fence to last," she cried, "and you've no right to come here threatening people. You! I could report you for animal abuse." She felt James at her shoulder, and she could hear her mother's voice trying to calm her down. But she could only think of Houdini lying in agony in Sam Western's yard, near death. Mr. Western's face turned thunderous. That means really angry. "And I'll have you arrested for trespassing," he stormed, "if I ever catch you two on my land again." "You poisoned Lydia's goat," Mandy shouted. "You poisoned the perfectly innocent goat." Never in her life had she felt so angry. He shook his head and waved his hands toward her as if swatting a fly. "Prove it," he said quietly. By now, Dr. Adam had joined them, and Lydia had taken a firm hold of Mandy's hand. "I think it's time to calm down," he said. "Nevertheless, I don't like the sound of what happened over at the hall. An animal like this doesn't rip off an entire branch, as I understand was the case. No, he'll nibble small mouthfuls of leaf quite happily, without realizing the damage he's doing to himself, but he wouldn't wrench off half a bush." Dr. Adam's voice was calm. His gaze was steady. "It does sound deliberate to me, as if someone intended to do harm." Mandy glared. James muttered under his breath. Sam Western backed off ever so slightly. "That's ridiculous," he said, but his voice had lost its bluster. "That's quite ridiculous." Mandy's father pressed on. "The SPCA would take a dim view, I know that." James and Mandy silently cheered him on. What a hero! By now, Mr. Western's resistance had melted. He knew when he was beaten. He'd come up to steamroll Lydia with threats and had met a stone wall of defense for her and her goats. After he left was a splutter of spite. "Well, I expected to find a trained man like you, Hope, up in the wilds defending an old goat woman who couldn't pay a vet's bill to save her life." Lydia's head went up. She just looked like Houdini at his most scornful. But she wouldn't lower herself by answering back. "I'd never have believed it. And of course, when I talk to my friends about this, I'll be suggesting they take their business elsewhere, to a vet with a bit more common sense. And that'll be the end of all of you at Animal Ark." They stood their ground. "Don't whisper," Dr. Adam whispered to Mandy. "We're much too well known in the area to let that sort of threat bother us." Mandy nodded. Sam Western stormed off, the two stocky white dogs to heel, swishing with his heavy stick at the flower heads in the lane. "Don't think you've heard the last of me," he shouted as his parting shot. They stood and stared at his broad back. Mandy still felt a little afraid. Perhaps he could still do Lydia and Animal Ark some damage. Only Houdini dared treat him with the contempt he deserved. He leaned his head back, opened his mouth, and filled the air with a deafening, mocking bray. I don't know that I've ever heard a goat bray. That would be interesting to hear. And obviously Houdini knows that Mr. Western was not being kind to his owner Lydia or his friends. So that's it for Goat in the Garden, Chapter 7. Chapter 8 gives us this little clue of cartons, and it looks like there's goats on the front. I wonder what that would be. There's not much left in the book. Chapter 8, 9, and 10. 3 more chapters, and we will end Goat in the Garden. Join in next time to find out what happens next.